firstly, I wanted to answer the question about May '68, which the politician's answer is, I'm very glad you asked that question. But I am actually glad you asked that question, because I was in Paris in April 1968, one of those great missed opportunities of history. And of course I followed it. I mean, it was all very agitating around there, even in April. And of course I followed it very, very closely in May '68. I was absolutely entranced by it. And I was absolutely, I couldn't believe that the election resulted in de Gaulle getting returned. I couldn't, you know, he was a Conservative president. I couldn't believe it, but of course, you know, this is why you learn these things over the years. Actually what happened was the struggle had gone down, the electoral system itself reasserted itself, and de Gaulle actually used the strength of the French state in order to base himself on the Conservatives and win. Now, could it have happened differently? Well, of course. I mean, the revolutionary left didn't really exist in Western capitalism before 1968. You know, except in tiny, tiny numbers of people. You know, it was true in France, it was true in, you know, there was a small group, the LCR and all the different groups, but they were tiny in Britain. And therefore this was the birth of the revolutionary left, really. It was the birth of when people broke from the old communist parties in quite big numbers because they didn't agree with what the communist parties were doing. Now, when you say the communist parties were rotten, it's not quite as simple as that, because actually, of course, lots and lots of workers in France and Italy and all these countries very, very much supported the communists, and they did so because the communists were the most decent fighters in the class struggle on a day-to-day issue. And also, even though de Gaulle always claimed he led the resistance against the Germans, actually he lived in London all the time, and it was the communists. So it was true in a whole number of countries in Europe who really were the leadership of the resistance, and they still carry, in Italy, they still carry support because of that, even 60 years later. It's incredible. It's an incredible thing. So they had that support from good people, but of course the leadership of the Communist Party, when it came to, you know, do we want a general strike, do we want to link up with the students, we have to calm it all down and get back to work, this was the problem. And of course something like the SWP wouldn't do that. Wouldn't do, you know, we would argue to continue the strikes and to challenge the whole of capitalist power. That was what was missing in May '68. But of course, in a way, this is a learning process for the whole working class, and they've gone out of, you know, 25 years of boom. There was still boom going on in terms of the economy and everything. So it was a learning process. In America, it was a learning process for the working class, the Black Panthers and the Civil Rights Movement and all these things. And people don't learn all at once, unfortunately. And, you know, so then when people talk about now and about how things are difficult, of course there are times when things are very difficult, and people refer to the councillor who left Respect. Now, people, you know, this happens. I mean, it doesn't just happen to councillors. We don't have many councillors, but it happens to people who are trade union officials who get, I mean, sometimes directly get bought off by the management. It happens to people in tenants associations, it happens to people because power seduces them, if you like. They're told they'll get a job or they'll get some money or whatever. I don't know what they offer different people, and people think the struggle's hard, maybe that's the best way to go. Now, actually, a lot of people don't think like that, and the important thing, I think, for socialists is not to regard those things as, you know, the end of the story, because they're not the end of the story. They are part of, and an unfortunate part of, what happens in politics, but to really say that what we have to do is to stick by our principles. And one of the reasons I'm standing, I mean, I do, you know, against Livingston. There's many things I agree with Livingston about, but I don't think he has stuck to his principles on a whole number of questions, including telling people it's right to cross picket lines, and including saying that it's all right for property developers in East London to pretty well have a heyday, which is what's going on in East London, and all that kind of thing. So I think it's very important. Now, the question of principles, I mean, there are wonderful human beings who stick to their principles without any effort whatsoever, and, you know, they're probably going to be canonised in the Catholic Church at some point, but most of us aren't like that. Most of us stick to our principles, firstly because we know what our principles are, secondly because we have over a period of time developed a politics which is a principled politics, and thirdly because, again, as part of a collective, this is what you do. And I would expect anybody, I mean, I knew miners who lost huge amounts of money in redundancy at the end of the miners' strike because they occupied their pits and they lost all the money. I knew a guy who was a convener in an engineering factory in Lancashire in the 1970s who lost, I think they offered him £10,000 at the time to go away. You know, he was too militant. They said, we'll give you the money if you just go. Now, you know, that's a hugely seductive thing to do. He didn't do it because he was a socialist and because he believed it was more, what use is the money? Now, right, that's a long-term view. In the short-term view, there's plenty of use to the money. But what use is to doing that if you can't maintain your principles and you can't stick to what being a socialist is? So therefore, there's always this. Actually, this is always a tradition of the working class movement. There's always people who become careerists and all this kind of thing. But there's a lot of people who don't. And I think that's the. Sorry, I'm being told to sum up. So I'll just say, just very, very quickly. One problem with my age is I can't read my notes very well. And a sign of my vanity that I won't put my glasses on. I'll put my glasses on. Okay, so yeah, and just the final point, which is the point that that Joel made about how do you link the day-to-day struggles with the bigger question. This is a question that all the time we have to think of ways we can organise, and have to think of ways we can bring people together. Sometimes you succeed in doing it and sometimes you don't. I'm going to a meeting tomorrow in South London where they're closing an arts centre. I've argued with them already at Hustings I had that they should occupy the arts centre. Now actually they've invited me back for a meeting. I don't know whether they want to do this, I've no idea. But that's what I'll argue. Now maybe I won't win it, and maybe then they'll get the padlocks on the building next week, and that'll be the end of the struggle. So that you don't know whether you're going to win these things or not, but you have to argue, and you have to use the whole range of socialist politics and experience and collective knowledge in order to bring that about. And that's really what it is all about. Now, why do you need the party just finally? I mean, it's very good that it does sort people's heads out, although not guaranteed. But I do think there is some truth in that. I think actually being part of a collective to change the world, there's no doubt does your depression a world of good, really, a lot of the time. But really the question here is, are we stronger when we're united, or are we stronger when we're divided? And there's absolutely no question that when we come together as an organised force, doing the same thing in different workplaces and schools and colleges, that is what really makes the difference, and that's why you need to be part of a revolutionary party which can change the world.